Hey everyone, tonight we begin with humanity's oldest friend and worst decision, alcohol. From ancient temples to medieval taverns, we've been finding creative ways to ruin mornings since civilization began. Before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you re-watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's tuning in from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before civilization, before writing, before anyone figured out how to boil water without burning down the hut, someone accidentally invented getting drunk. It happened around 7000 BCE in Neolithic China, when a farmer left a pot filled with rice, honey, and fruit sitting around too long. The mixture, fermented as all neglected things, turned into a bubbling, mysterious potion that smelled like both curiosity and regret. At some point, a human, maybe hungry, maybe stupid, definitely bored, decided to drink it. That moment was the dawn of human history. Not the invention of the wheel, not the discovery of fire, but the instant someone looked at a suspicious jar of spoiled fruit and said, "Yeah, I'll risk it." The first sip was confusing. The second felt amazing. By the third, our prehistoric hero was trying to explain emotions to a goat. The world spun, trees looked philosophical, and everyone suddenly seemed like a really good dancer. It must have felt divine at least, until they collapsed face first into a puddle of mud. Congratulations, humanity. You've just discovered alcohol. And about 5 hours later, the concept of consequences. Archaeologists would later find 9,000-year-old pottery jars at the site of Jahu, still stained with traces of that ancient brew blend of rice, honey, and hawthorn fruit, the world's earliest cocktail. Basically, the prehistoric version of whatever's in the fridge. Chemical analysis confirmed it was fermented, which means it wasn't an accident anymore. Someone got drunk, survived, and decided to do it again on purpose. And that's how the world's first hangover was born. The next morning, our ancient innovator woke up dehydrated, dizzy, and inventing the world's first excuse. It must been something I ate. But that wasn't just a drink, it was humanity's first coping mechanism. A portable vacation from reality long before there were jobs, taxes, or neighbors to blame. So yes, while later civilizations would build pyramids, write laws, and split atoms, this is where it truly began. One forgotten jar, one bad decision, and one species realizing that sometimes oblivion tastes pretty good. If you ever needed proof that humans have their priorities completely backward, look no further than Mesopotamia around 4000 BCE. While the rest of nature was busy evolving to survive, humanity invented beer, and only afterward thought, you know what might go well with this? Food. Yes, beer came before bread. People were brewing barley long before they figured out how to bake it. Archaeologists found ancient tablets showing Sumerians joyfully drinking from massive communal pots through long straws, 'cause even then, no one liked sharing germs. These weren't dainty cups either. Imagine a group of adults hunched over what looks like a muddy punch bowl, sipping in silence and pretending it's a spiritual experience. That was civilization's first happy hour. The Sumerians didn't just drink beer, they worshipped it. They even had a goddess of brewing named Ninkasi, because of course they did. Her Himyas, an actual him also, doubles as the world's oldest surviving beer recipe. Civilization began, not with philosophy, but with a slightly tipsy choir praising a divine bartender. Beer wasn't a luxury. It was infrastructure. Ancient water was basically a bacterial lottery, but the process of brewing, boiling, fermenting made beer safe to drink. In other words, drinking beer wasn't irresponsible. It was the healthiest choice available. Imagine explaining that to your doctor today. Beer was part of daily life. Workers, priests, even children got their share. And it wasn't the fizzy golden stuff we know now. It was thick, sweet, and full of barley bits. Archaeologists call it nutrient-rich, which in modern terms means drinkable oatmeal with a buzz. And somehow, this murky brew fueled the world's first cities. People farmed, built temples, and wrote cuneiform tablets while maintaining a steady state of mild intoxication. Which explains why half of early Sumerian laws sound like they were written at closing time. So yes, beer built civilization, not logic, not language, not ambition, just a group of dehydrated farmers solving the world's problems, one foamy bowl at a time. If Mesopotamia invented beer, Egypt turned it into a lifestyle. By 3000 BCE, the Nile Valley had mastered the art of getting tipsy before lunch. Beer wasn't a treat, was daily nutrition. It appeared at breakfast, in prayer offerings, as wages, and even at funerals. Technically, you could live your entire life on bread, onions, and beer, which explains why most ancient Egyptians looked both productive and perpetually tired. For common people, beer was cheap and thick, more like liquid porridge than a drink. It was brewed from barley and emmer wheat, sweetened with dates, and poured into clay jugs that probably had been cleaned since the reign of the last guy. Still, it was safer than Nile water, which came with bonus parasites. The average peasant drank 2 to 3 liters a day, meaning half of Egyptian civilization was quietly buzzed. Even children drank it not because ancient Egypt was wild, but because sober hydration wasn't an option. When the water gives you dysentery, beer for breakfast suddenly sounds perfectly reasonable. Parents would fill clay cups for their kids and send them off to school like it was orange juice. And we wonder why math was invented elsewhere. Meanwhile, the upper class preferred windy, official drink of people who didn't do manual labor. Pharaohs imported it from Syria and Greece, stored it in ornate jars, and pretended it was sophistication instead of fermented grape juice. Cleopatra herself supposedly had her own vineyard, because apparently ruling Egypt required both charm and Cabernet. Temples brewed beer on an industrial scale, and workers building the pyramids were paid in daily rations of bread and beer, meaning the most iconic monument on Earth was fueled by carbohydrates and mild inebriation. Even the afterlife was stocked with booze. Tomb paintings show servants pouring beer for the dead, ensuring eternal refreshment and, presumably, eternal hangovers. So while Egypt gave us papyrus, geometry, and divine kingship, it also gave us something far more relatable, the eternal truth that life is easier to handle when it's slightly blurry around the edges. While the Egyptians were drinking bread, soup, and calling it beer, the Chinese were doing something far more refined, or at least pretending to. Around 3000 BCE, early brewers in the Yellow River Valley began fermenting rice, millet, and fruit into beverages that actually tasted intentional. Archaeologists have found ornate bronze vessels still coated with residue from those ancient drinks, proof that humanity is ability to turn dinner into liquid regret had now gone global. But unlike other cultures that stumbled into intoxication by accident, the Chinese organized it. Fermentation wasn't luck, it was chemistry, backed by ritual and religion. Alcohol was considered a gift from the heavens, a shimmering bridge between mortals and their ancestors, poetic. Until you remember that this bridge usually ended with someone singing off-key before passing out in a rice field. Drinking wasn't just leisure, it was sacred. Kings and nobles in ancient China held grand ceremonies where wine was first offered to the spirits and then immediately to themselves, purely for safety testing, of course. Ancient texts even mention officials who lost their jobs for being too sober at court banquets, because abstaining wasn't just uncool, it was politically dangerous. The Chinese didn't brew casually, they engineered it. They refined fermentation vessels, standardized recipes, and even documented drinking etiquette. By the Shang dynasty, around 1600 BCE, court life had become one long, well-funded tasting session, complete with official drinking songs, bronze cups shaped like animals, and the first bureaucratic memos warning against excess, because even the world's oldest administration realized that productivity plummets when half your ministers are horizontal. Yet, despite the chaos, alcohol remained sacred, the water of life, as early poets called it. It inspired calligraphy, music, and the kind of philosophy that only makes sense until you reread it sober. Even Confucius, the future champion of restraint, warned against drunkenness with the weary tone of someone who definitely knew what he was talking about. So while other civilizations were still trying to keep their beer from exploding, the Chinese were already perfecting banquet etiquette, toasting ancestors, and probably forgetting half their toasts by dessert. Civilization, it turns out, doesn't truly begin until someone's offering spiritual enlightenment with a side of fermented fruit. If there's one thing that unites all early civilizations, it's their determination to make sure someone was drinking during the invention of writing. In Mesopotamia, around 2700 BCE, alcohol wasn't just a beverage, it was a plot device. The world's oldest story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, reads like a poetic warning about friendship, mortality, and the dangers of drinking outside your comfort zone. It introduces Enkidu, a wild man living among animals, until a woman lures him into civilization with two irresistible offers, bread and beer. After his first drink, Enkidu became human, which is a polite way of saying he discovered the magic of lowered standards. The Sumerians didn't think alcohol corrupted man. They believed it completed him. Somewhere, a modern philosopher is still trying to make that argument with less evidence. In Mesopotamia, beer wasn't just social, it was sacred. Temples doubled as breweries, priests moonlighted as bartenders, and offerings to the gods often came with a fresh pint. Archaeologists have uncovered clay tablets with recipes and hymns to Ninkasi, the goddess of beer, reading less like scripture and more like ancient pub songs. Praise the brew, stir the mash, and may your liver hold out another year. Beer was liquid bread, a phrase that made fasting sound noble and happy hour sound holy. It was also practical, a way to preserve grain and avoid contaminated water. Workers building temples and canals were paid in daily beer rations, and somewhere between the fifth and sixth sip, civilization started to make sense. Bureaucracy was born in barley foam, accountants recording beer quotas, priests blessing barrels, poets immortalizing the bliss of a good buzz. If Mesopotamia drank for civilization, and Egypt drank for religion, the Greeks drank for conversation, and sometimes to forget the one they just had. By 600 BCE, Greece had transformed drinking into a social institution, the symposium, literally drinking together, which, to be fair, remains the backbone of Western philosophy. It wasn't quite a tavern or a frat party, though the line was thin. Guests reclined on couches while servants poured wine, musicians played, and philosophers took turns pretending to be profound. They even appointed a symposiarch, the designated adult responsible for watering down the wine, because Greek wine was so potent it could make a Spartan hug someone. Drinking it straight was considered barbaric, something Thracians did before invading your city. For the Greeks, moderation defined civilization, though it's worth noting that most symposiums ended with someone crying, singing, or waking up next to a broken lyre. The gods, naturally, had their own drinking scene. Dionysus, the god of wine and chaos, presided over every hangover and bad decision. His followers roamed the hills, dancing, shouting, and making modern music festivals look like book club meetings. To the Greeks, intoxication wasn't indulgence, it was divine madness, a temporary crack in the human shell through which truth could leak. Even philosophers weren't immune. Plato's symposium turned a drunken debate into a meditation on love, beauty, and eternal truth, because apparently nothing says enlightenment like slurred metaphysics. You can almost picture Socrates, cup in hand, insisting that virtue is knowledge, while someone else tries to remember whose cup that was. Of course, the Greeks also gave us the first hangover cure, cabbage. Eat it before drinking, they said, and you'll be fine. It didn't work, but it perfectly captured humanity's eternal optimism in the face of obvious consequences. The Greeks mixed reason with chaos, logic with wine, and gave birth to Western philosophy somewhere between refills. Civilization had finally realized that deep thought flows best when you can blame it on the alcohol. Every civilization has its party god, but the Greeks perfected theirs. Dionysus, barefoot, wild-eyed, bottle in hand, was the divine embodiment of wine, ecstasy, and questionable decisions. While other gods handed down laws and morals, Dionysus handed you a cup and said, "Let's feel something." His cult spread like spilled wine across the Mediterranean, mostly led by women called Maenads, who abandoned their homes to dance in the mountains under the influence of divine enthusiasm and fermented grapes. To outsiders, it looked like madness. To believers, transcendence. The Greeks didn't see drunkenness as sin. They saw it as revelation, a holy kind of insanity that stripped away logic and let mortals glimpse the divine. His festivals, the Dionysia, began as wine-soaked parades and somehow evolved into theater. Yes, Western drama, tragedy, and comedy were born from drinking festivals. Actors wore masks, choruses sang hymns, and audiences maintained a respectable level of intoxication that modern critics would call immersive participation. But Dionysus wasn't all chaos. His myths warned that rejecting joy was just as dangerous as excess. King Pentheus tried to ban his cult, calling it indecent, and ended up torn apart by the very Maenads he tried to stop, a poetic reminder to never stand between a Greek and their weekend plans. For the philosophers, Dionysus represented the chaos of the human soul, the opposite of Apollo, god of order. Together, they symbolized the eternal tug-of-war between reason and instinct. The voice that says, "Be responsible," and the one that whispers, "One more, 1 hurt." In Dionysus, the Greeks found both creation and destruction, the bliss of surrender and the hangover that follows enlightenment. Civilization needed both gods. Without Apollo, there's no structure. Without Dionysus, there's nothing worth writing about. Then came Rome, a civilization that didn't just drink, it industrialized intoxication. If the Greeks drank for philosophy, the Romans drank for everything else: politics, religion, hygiene, boredom. Their favorite saying, "In vino veritas," in wine there is truth, explained both their poetry and their poor decisions. Wine was the bloodstream of the empire, flowing from the slums to the Senate, from legionnaires to emperors. Everyone drank. Soldiers received daily wine rations instead of water, which raises important questions about Roman military strategy. Farmers, slaves, senators, all of them kept their cups full. To be Roman was to believe that civilization itself was best experienced slightly drunk, marching hundreds of miles through Gaul while mildly buzzed. Bold move, Caesar. The Romans didn't just drink wine, they built an empire on it. Vineyards stretched across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, cultivating hundreds of varieties that, by modern standards, were barely drinkable. Ancient wine was syrupy, acidic, and so unpleasant that Romans mixed it with honey, herbs, seawater, or anything else that might distract from the taste. Think less, fine vintage, more liquid dare. At feasts, guests reclined on couches, surrounded by silver cups and regret, while servants poured endlessly, and philosophers shouted half-coherent Latin about virtue. Drinking wasn't about flavor, it was about status. The wealthier the Roman, the stranger the recipe. Caligula supposedly dissolved pearls into his wine just to prove he could, or perhaps to explain why everyone at dinner looked terrified. A few voices tried to preach moderation. The Stoics warned that self-control was the path to wisdom, though given that they lived under emperors like Nero, you can't really blame them for occasionally breaking their own rules. Public drunkenness wasn't a scandal. It was practically a civic duty. Poets wrote odes to hangovers, and even the gods were enthusiastic drinkers. Bacchus, Rome's take on Dionysus, inspired festivals so chaotic that the Senate tried to ban them, which of course only made them more popular. Rome built roads, aqueducts, and empires, but perhaps its most enduring legacy was social drinking. When the empire finally collapsed, it wasn't just to barbarians or bad politics. It was partly to that eternal Roman motto, "We'll deal with it tomorrow." While the Greeks philosophized over wine and the Romans drowned in it, the Persians turned drinking into poetry. To them, wine was not just a drink, but a form of devotion, a ritual of beauty, faith, and the occasional public scandal. In ancient Achaemenid Persia, kings hosted banquets lavish enough to feed a small city. Herodotus claimed guests were expected to get drunk before making important decisions because, according to Persian logic, a plan tested both sober and drunk had double the integrity, a system that worked perfectly until someone suggested invading Greece after dessert. Centuries later, during the Islamic Golden Age, alcohol became a subject of divine irony. The Quran forbade it, yet Persian poets couldn't stop writing about it. They called it the forbidden nectar, the ruby of the soul. Liquid wisdom, creative loopholes disguised as literature. No one captured this better than Omar Khayyam, the 11th century astronomer, mathematician, and unapologetic wine enthusiast who turned hangovers into philosophy. His Rubaiyat reads like a soft rebellion, verses drenched in nostalgia, longing, and sly defiance. A jug of wine, a loaf of bread, and thou, he wrote, which is basically ancient Persian for romantic picnic under religious surveillance. In truth, Persian society had a complicated relationship with the bottle. Publicly, wine was sinful. Privately, it was an art form. Aristocrats drank in lush gardens, surrounded by fountains, poetry, and plausible deniability. They toasted to love, beauty, and the hypocrisy of their own laws. Persian physicians even prescribed diluted wine for health, claiming it strengthened the spirit and improved digestion, which means medieval doctors were already handing out excuses. When European travelers arrived, they were astonished to find that this dry civilization was quietly running some of the finest wineries in the world. Persians didn't drink to forget. They drank to remember beautifully, turning intoxication into metaphor and metaphor into immortality. Meanwhile, north of the crumbling Roman borders, the so-called barbarians were far less poetic and far more efficient. The Celts, Germans, and Norse didn't care about etiquette, philosophy, or proper dilution ratios. They cared about results. The Greeks mocked them for drinking wine straight. The barbarians mocked the Greeks for being boring. Their preferred brews were mead and ale, and they consumed them in heroic quantities. Mead, fermented honey and water, was the drink of kings, warriors, and anyone who could stay upright long enough to refill their horn. The Vikings believed mead came from the gods themselves, a mythical vat filled with honey and poetry. The fact that this beverage inspired both epic sagas and spontaneous axe-throwing contests tells you everything about its potency. The Celts brewed their own beer in clay pots, flavoring it with herbs instead of hops and drinking it from communal bowls, while shouting toasts that probably sounded profound at night and incomprehensible in the morning. In Celtic culture, hospitality meant refilling your guest's cup until they reached spiritual enlightenment or unconsciousness, whichever came first. The Germans, meanwhile, developed ale so strong that even Roman diplomats wrote home about it. Tacitus described the German tribes as fierce, brave, and fond of drunken councils, which is Latin for they keep making military plans they can't remember. To the northern tribes, drinking wasn't just recreation, it was ritual. Alcohol connected them to their ancestors and their gods. Warriors drank before battle to gain courage, and afterward to forget what they'd done with it. Mead was sacred at funerals, weddings, and any occasion that could be made slightly louder. When Rome finally fell, the barbarians didn't shock the world by drinking, they shocked it by celebrating. Where Rome had laws, they had toasts. Where Rome had rhetoric, they had rhythm. And in the end, the so-called barbarians didn't just conquer the empire, they outdrank it. History's most intoxicating victory. When the empire's ruins settled, it left behind three things: crumbling roads, questionable water, and a continental hangover. Out of that chaos rose an unlikely savior, the monk. No armor, no sword, just a robe, a prayer, and a talent for brewing. While kings waged wars and barbarians crowned themselves, monks quietly perfected the art of fermentation. In cold, drafty monasteries, from France to Bavaria, they discovered that beer could be more than survival fluid. It could be holy hydration. During fasting, when food was forbidden but liquids were allowed, they brewed thick, nourishing beer they called liquid bread. It was theology in a tankard. Obey God, stay hydrated, and feel pleasantly detached from worldly suffering. Medieval monastic beer wasn't the clear golden brew we know today. It was dense, cloudy, and so full of calories you could practically chew it. The monks experimented with yeast, temperature, and patience, centuries before craft beer became a personality trait. Their brewing logs were more meticulous than royal chronicles because priorities. Each monastery had its own style. The Benedictines preferred malty sweetness, the Cistercians chaste purity, and the Trappists mastered patience, the virtue most useful when your entire life revolves around waiting for fermentation. Beer wasn't just sustenance, it was an economy. Monks sold it to pilgrims, travelers, and peasants who needed to forget feudalism for a night. The church tolerated it because it worked. Beer was safer than water and kept the masses calm. A slightly drunk peasantry was a peaceful one, and monasteries conveniently controlled production. Holiness remained profitable. Some historians even argue that monks saved brewing itself. Without their careful records, beer might have vanished alongside Roman plumbing and decent hygiene. Instead, they turned it into science. When you crack open a Belgian ale today, you retasting the devotion of men who took vows of silence and then invented a drink that made silence enjoyable. So while knights chased glory and kings claimed crowns, monks earned something far more enduring: the eternal gratitude of anyone who ever needed to make medieval life a little more bearable. And as they brewed their salvation, one barrel at a time, the rest of medieval Europe searched for joy in a simpler form: mead, the golden, honey-sweet ancestor of every comfort drink. Before hops became fashionable, mead was the drink of choice for kings, peasants, and anyone trying to forget the weather for a few blessed hours. It was easy to make honey, water, and a dash of reckless optimism. Fermentation did the rest. In the cold, gray north, where grapes refused to grow and barley froze half the year, mead became the closest thing to happiness in a cup, liquid sunlight in a world of mud and superstition. By the 12th century, Islamic chemists had even mastered distillation, creating the world's first true spirits, though they wisely called them medicine to avoid trouble. Ironically, the word alcohol itself comes from the Arabic alcohol, meaning the essence. The very culture that forbade it also gave it a name. Officially, Islam went dry. Unofficially, it poured its rebellion into poetry. Meanwhile, back in Europe, people were discovering that drinking together was civilization's favorite pastime. By the 13th century, the tavern had arrived, a public house where everyone could gather to drink, argue, and forget their problems for a few glorious hours. Taverns were democracy before democracy, louder, stickier, and much better lubricated. Lords had castles, priests had cathedrals, and commoners had the pub. Inside, the floors were straw, the air was smoke, and the rules were simple: drink, sing, and blame everything on the king. For travelers, taverns were lifesavers. For locals, they were therapy. They were also some of the few places where class didn't tea. A monk could argue with a blacksmith. A farmer could complain to a knight, and everyone could agree that last week's ale was better. Many were run by alewives, women who brewed and sold beer with a mix of skill and defiance. Their broomsticks, cauldrons, and cats later inspired much of Europe's witch imagery. Medieval feminism, as it turns out, smelled faintly of hops. Taverns soon became the birthplace of politics. Revolutions rarely started in palaces. They started when someone, 3 pints in, declared, "You know what we should do." From peasant uprisings to Renaissance conspiracies, history's most dangerous ideas were often born in places with questionable sanitation. Authorities despised taverns, kings feared sedition, priests feared sin, and innkeepers feared running out of beer. but they couldn't be stopped. Ban the pub, and it just moved down the road. By the late 15th century, taverns weren't just drinking holes. They were the pulse of European life, shaping gossip, music, revolution, and perhaps, most importantly, the world's first attempts at public restrooms. As Europe staggered into the Renaissance, it did so with a hangover stretching back 1,000 years. Civilization had survived plagues, wars, and theology, all marinated in ale. When the Renaissance came, people simply swapped mead for wine and called it enlightenment. The age of reason, ironically, was drenched in alcohol. Scholars debated astronomy and metaphysics over jugs of cheap red. Leonardo da Vinci drank in moderation. Michelangelo preferred wine to water. Erasmus joked that clear thinking required a full stomach and a not-too-empty glass. Printing spread ideas, but taverns spread opinions faster. Coffee houses hadn't arrived yet, so beer remained Europe's original Wi-Fi, connecting merchants, artists, and sailors through shared intoxication. New drinks appeared: distilled spirits from alchemists' labs, sweet wines from the Mediterranean, and tonics that promised to cure everything except the reason you drank in the first place. The age of exploration was, among other things, the global distribution of drunkenness. Ships carried rum, wine, and brandy across oceans, ensuring that no new world would ever be too sober. At home, alcohol became theater. Royal banquets overflowed with fountains of wine, because nothing says divine right like sticky floors. Henry VIII brewed his own ale, proving you can dismantle a church and still be a proud homebrewer. Peasants, as always, stuck to weak beer and stubborn optimism. By the 17th century, Europe stood at the threshold of modernity, armed with science, printing, and politics, yet still clutching a mug. The church had doctrine, universities had reason, but the taverns had attendance. It's tempting to treat alcohol as a historical footnote, but it's really the rhythm behind the story. From ancient rice brews to Renaissance vineyards, humanity's true genius has always been endurance, and somewhere along the way, we discovered that endurance tastes a lot better when it's fermented. In the crowded heart of ancient Athens, where marble temples glowed beneath the relentless sun and every alley hummed with barter and gossip, the true rhythm of the city was not set by philosophers or politicians, but by the smell of food cooking in the streets. Smoke curled from clay pots and makeshift braziers, carrying the scent of roasting meat, warm bread, and honey that clung to the air like a promise. This was where life happened, in the hands of street vendors, who fed a civilization one bite at a time. The Agora, Athens' beating marketplace, was more than a place to buy olives or debate democracy, was an open-air kitchen, alive with noise, laughter, and the hiss of oil hitting hot stone. Early in the morning, when the marble steps were still cool and the city had not yet woken to argument, the first vendors appeared. They came dragging carts or carrying baskets slung over their shoulders, setting up near fountains or temple gates. They sold what ordinary people could afford: barley cakes still steaming from flat griddles, cheese wrapped in leaves, figs sticky with sweetness, olives glistening like black pearls. The air was thick with the mingling scents of grain and brine, smoke and salt. For many Athenians, breakfast meant a piece of bread dipped in olive oil or a handful of dried fruit, eaten standing up, arguing about politics. Barley was the backbone of their diet, ground into flour and turned into flat, chewy cakes that could be eaten on the move. A vendor would press them onto hot stones, brush them with oil, maybe scatter a few herbs, and hand them off wrapped in fig leaves. Simple, quick, perfect for the man rushing to the assembly or the woman carrying water home from the well. Food in the streets was more than convenience, it was necessity. Workers, sailors, merchants, slaves, all needed sustenance that fit their pace. Nobody had time for banquets before noon. But if bread was survival, meat was spectacle. On nearly every corner during festivals or market days, smoke would rise from tiny fires where skewers of meat sizzled over coals. Small cubes of pork or lamb, threaded onto thin metal rods, turned golden under the watchful eye of the cook. The scent drew crowds. Men fresh from the gymnasium, dusty with sweat, would gather and shout orders, trading coins for skewers they devoured before the meat had time to cool. It was fast, cheap, and intoxicatingly good. Later generations would call it souvlaki, but even then, the Greeks had already perfected the art of the portable feast. Fish, too, ruled the stalls near the harbor. Sardines, mullet, and small mackerel were cleaned and grilled on the spot. The smell of the sea never left the city. Fishermen's wives sat with baskets of salted anchovies and fresh octopus, selling by weight or by hunger. A man could buy a slice of bread, a drizzle of oil, and a grilled fish, and call it lunch fit for a god. They didn't need plates. Bread served as both utensil and dish, soaking up oil and sauce before being devoured in one last bite. Even philosophers found themselves seduced by such simplicity. You could imagine Socrates himself pausing mid-debate to tear into a hot barley cake, oil dripping from his fingers as he explained virtue. Not everything was savory. Sweet vendors offered little luxuries to balance the salt of olives and fish. They sold nuts coated in honey, small pastries filled with cheese and baked until golden or syrupy grapes reduced to thick, rich must pudding. The sweetest aroma in the market came from grape must boiled until it thickened, stirred constantly with wooden spoons. When cooled, it set like jelly and was eaten with nuts or sesame. For a few coins, you could hold the sun in a cup, its warmth spreading through your fingers as you walked the crowded streets. Cheese pies were another crowd favorite. Layers of thin dough stuffed with soft cheese, brushed with oil, and baked until crisp. Vendors cut them into squares, wrapped them in fig leaves, and sold them by the handful. In some corners, you'd see people arguing about politics with one hand and holding a steaming slice with the other. It was democracy at its hungriest. And though philosophers might write about moderation, everyone knew that good food was its own philosophy. Olives and nuts were the universal snack. Clay bowls lined the counters, filled with green and black olives steeped in brine, almonds roasted over open flame, walnuts cracked open and sold by the piece. Children crowded around these stalls, fingers sticky with honey, faces dusted with flour. The marketplace was a playground of flavor, a place where the poor and the wealthy brushed shoulders, united by hunger. Festivals transformed the streets into banquets. During the Dionysian celebrations, vendors lined the roads leading to the theater, their braziers glowing red through the night. The crowd, tipsy on cheap wine, gorged on skewers and honey cakes before cheering tragedies that mirrored their own messy, marvelous lives. When the plays ended, the feast began again. Food was part of every ritual, every worship, every joy. You could not honor the gods on an empty stomach. The vendors themselves were a breed apart. Some were farmers, bringing surplus grain. Others were widows and laborers, surviving on their skill with dough and spice. They shouted over each other, their voices carrying like birdsong through the market. Each had a signature call, a rhythm of words meant to lure the hungry. Hot cakes, still warm, cheese, pies, crisp and sweet, fish fresh from the sea. The chorus never stopped. Even when the midday sun scorched the marble streets, they stayed, fanning their coals, pouring oil, turning bread. In the evenings, when shadows lengthened and the heat finally softened, the market changed its rhythm. The crowd thinned, replaced by travelers, lovers, and drunk poets wandering from one stall to another. Torches flickered, casting orange light on faces and food. Somewhere a flute played, somewhere else laughter erupted as someone spilled wine. The smell of smoke mixed with honey and sea salt filled the air. Street food was no longer just a meal, it was an experience, a taste of belonging. Proof that life was worth savoring, even in its smallest bites. Over time, certain stalls became legend. The man near the Piraeus gate, whose fish was always crisp but never dry. The woman who baked the best cheese pies near the olive market. Her secret, a touch of time in the filling. Travelers wrote about these things. Sailors carried their memories across the sea. A good vendor could make his fortune without ever owning land, simply by knowing how to please the human tongue. Of course, not every meal was perfect. Some meat burned, some wine soured, some fish turned under the heat, but people came anyway. They trusted their senses, not rules. Food was judged by smell, color, and the confidence of the cook. If he smiled and handed it to you with pride, you ate it. And maybe you regretted it later, but mostly you didn't. Because even then, even 2.5 millennia ago, people knew that the best meals were the ones shared under open skies, bought from strangers who somehow felt like friends. The streets themselves became recipes, each corner with its own flavor, each alley with its own dish. Students discussed philosophy over warm lentil soup. Fishermen sang songs between bites of grilled sardine. Children chased each other with sticky fingers, and old men sipped watered wine beside bread sellers. Life happened between bites. That was the essence of ancient Greece, not just temples and speeches, but food that united everyone in a shared hunger for taste, warmth, and connection. As night deepened, the vendors packed their baskets, raked the coals, and counted their coins. The last breadcrumbs scattered to the pigeons. The marketplace fell silent. Only the faint scent of smoke and honey left behind. But come morning, it would all begin again, the rhythm of footsteps, the clang of amphorae, the hiss of hot oil, the endless chatter of a city feeding itself. The philosophers could keep their theories. The real wisdom of Athens was simpler. Happiness begins at the first bite. As centuries turned and empires shifted, the simple food stalls of Greece didn't disappear. They evolved, flowing like olive oil into new forms and new hands. The Romans came with their legions, their roads, their gods, and their appetites, and they fell instantly in love with what they found sizzling on the Athenian streets. Soldiers who had grown up on porridge and rations discovered the joy of grilled meat dripping with lemon and herbs, of bread crisped on fire until it crackled beneath their teeth. They took these flavors home, and Greece, without meaning to, seasoned the empire. Street food became diplomacy, a quiet language spoken through taste. Where banners changed, bread stayed. In the ports of the Aegean, vendors adapted to the new hunger of foreign sailors. They began to serve what would later be called gyros in spirit, if not in name. Thin slices of roasted meat, shaved from a turning spit, stuffed into soft bread, topped with onion and sauce. No one wrote it down, but every traveler remembered it. The sight of a spinning roast under an open sky became a kind of promise. Wherever smoke rose, there would be warmth, laughter, and something good to eat. Greek cooks were masters of improvisation. They could make a feast from scraps, transforming goat offcuts into skewers, lentils into stew, olives into tapenade-like spreads served on bread that smelled faintly of firewood. Markets near temples grew into full-blown culinary centers. The smell of sesame oil, fish sauce, and baking bread would linger between columns of marble and shade of cypress. Housewives bought hot snacks while bargaining for amphorae of wine, and children waited in line for honey cakes shaped like coins, warm enough to melt in their hands. Food was not a distraction from life, it was its rhythm. When the orators shouted in the squares, when traders from Egypt and Phoenicia haggled over spices, when priests offered prayers to the gods, the scent of frying dough floated over everything like a hymn everyone knew by heart. The food itself began to travel farther than the people. Merchants carried jars of preserved olives, amphorae of oil, and packets of dried herbs across the sea. Somewhere in the Roman markets, far from the Athenian sun, a vendor would unwrap a fig leaf and reveal something unmistakably Greek. And somewhere, a Roman official would bite into it, close his eyes, and taste the same blend of salt, honey, and smoke that had fed generations in the shadow of the Parthenon. But even as influence spread, the streets of Greece kept their own soul. The humble stalls survived invasions, earthquakes, and new rulers because they belonged to no one and everyone. When soldiers marched past, they stopped to eat. When philosophers debated fate, they argued over food. When lovers met in secret, they did so near the stalls that sold roasted nuts or fried cheese wrapped in dough. Food witnessed everything: wars, weddings, festivals, and farewells, and it never judged. It was there when words failed. In the quiet villages, away from Athens, street vendors were storytellers too. They carried not only food, but gossip, songs, and news. A man might arrive in a mountain town with a cart of bread and olives, and leave with 10 new tales to tell at the next stop. The rhythm of his footsteps became the pulse of Greek life. Even now, if you close your eyes, you can imagine that distant sound, the soft clatter of pottery, the hum of voices, and the hiss of oil meeting dough. Time rolled forward. The great temples' aged philosophers turned to dust, and empires fractured, but the streets still smelled of garlic and smoke. When the Byzantine era dawned, the empire that rose from the ruins of Greece and Rome carried forward this culinary heartbeat. Constantinople, gleaming and crowded, took the street food traditions of ancient Greece and gave them new grandeur. Greek cooks, now serving emperors and traders alike, layered their flavors with spices brought from the east. Cinnamon, clove, and pepper joined the chorus, blending with honey and herbs in a dance that blurred lines between meal and memory. In narrow alleys of the capital, street vendors set up beside the great bazaars, their stalls glowing with coals. They sold flatbreads stuffed with cheese and herbs, honey fritters, still bubbling from oil, skewers of marinated lamb brushed with vinegar and thyme. The rich might dine on gold plates, but the poor ate from paper, and both left equally satisfied. Sailors from across the Mediterranean carried tales of Constantinople's food like treasure, how one could walk from dawn till dusk and eat something different at every corner. Each dish a story told through spice and flame. But in Greece itself, far from the glittering capital, the streets still held onto the old ways. In the fishing towns, vendors sold dried fish with lemon and oregano, their voices rising above the gulls. Farmers' wives roasted chickpeas and lentils on flat stones, sprinkling salt over them as they turned golden. The shepherds returning from the mountains brought cheese to market, trading it for bread and wine. Everything connected, the land, the sea, the people. Nothing was wasted, and everything was shared. As Christianity spread, it reshaped rituals, but not appetites. The fasts and feasts of the new faith offered fresh opportunities for food to shine. On fasting days, vendors sold lentil soup thickened with olive oil, onions, and herbs. On feast days, the streets overflowed with roasted lamb, honeyed pastries, and wine so sweet it felt like sunlight in a cup. Festivals echoed the old ones, only the names had changed. The laughter, the dancing, the endless smell of food that was eternal. By the time foreign crusaders began to pass through Greek lands, the streets had become a kind of living museum of flavor. A traveler could taste 1,000 years of history in one meal: the barley of the old farmers, the olive oil of ancient Athens, the spices of Byzantium, the sweetness of honey that had never stopped flowing. The Crusaders wrote of the food they found, though not in books or chronicles, but in the way they never forgot it. When they returned home, they tried to copy it, to recreate that memory of warmth and spice that no northern kitchen could match. Street food remained a theater for the senses. The clang of metal pans, the spark of oil catching flame, the laughter of people eating together without pretense. It was the heartbeat of a culture that refused to die, even under new rulers, even through wars and plagues. The vendors returned each morning to the same corners, carrying on traditions older than memory. They didn't need monuments. Their legacy was edible. Sometimes, travelers from distant lands mistook the food for simple fare, calling it rustic or common. But they didn't see what it carried: the wisdom of centuries, the balance of salt and sweet, the careful economy of survival turned into art. In every dish, there was philosophy, harmony between earth and sea, restraint in abundance, pleasure without greed. The Greeks had never forgotten that lesson. They believed that food, like life, should nourish both body and soul. On quiet evenings, when the last of the vendors sat by their dying fires, the scent of roasted meat and honey still lingered in the air. It rose like incense, mingling with prayers and stories. Somewhere nearby, a group of friends passed around a jug of wine, sharing the last scraps of bread and cheese as stars appeared over the hills. They spoke of heroes and gods, of wars won and lost, but always, somehow. They circled back to food, to the meal in front of them, to the joy of sharing it, to the comfort of taste that outlasted time. And so, the tradition endured. The stalls that had once fed the citizens of ancient Athens now fed their descendants. The recipes passed down not in books, but by memory and hand. Even as new rulers came, even as languages changed, the streets of Greece remained what they had always been: a feast under open sky. A place where history wasn't studied, but tasted, one bite at a time. Centuries passed like tides against the stone walls of old Greece, washing away conquerors, but never the smell of grilled bread. When the Ottomans arrived, bringing their spices and kebabs, the Greek streets did what they had always done. They adapted. Markets that once echoed with the chants of ancient vendors now hummed with new rhythms, but the essence remained. Oil hissed in pans, dough rose in clay ovens, and the streets kept feeding whoever walked them. Greek cooks borrowed flavors without surrendering their identity. From the Turks came cumin and yogurt. From the Arabs came syrup-soaked pastries. And from the Greeks came the soul that turned them into something more than food. It was memory on a plate, resilience wrapped in phyllo. In narrow alleys of Thessaloniki, merchants sold meat roasted on spits, the ancestor of modern souvlaki, marinated with herbs gathered from the mountains. Women in headscarves kneaded dough for pies stuffed with spinach, feta, or leeks, folding each layer like a prayer. Coffee boiled in copper pots over hot sand, its aroma curling into the air like prophecy. The conquerors might have claimed the cities, but the streets still belonged to the people, to the bakers and vendors who woke before dawn to keep the fire alive. In the countryside, food became the last defense of identity. When language was forbidden and traditions suppressed, families kept their culture alive through recipes whispered across generations. A grandmother rolling phyllo was an act of quiet rebellion. A pot of lentil soup simmering in olive oil was a reminder that history could be rewritten, but taste could not. Even the poorest household offered guests something to eat: a piece of bread, a handful of olives, a cup of sweetened coffee, because hospitality was the oldest Greek law, one no empire could erase. By the 19th century, when revolution stirred and Greece began to reclaim itself, the streets once again filled with the scent of freedom disguised as food. Soldiers, students, and poets crowded around vendors selling roasted chestnuts, fried dough dipped in honey, and grilled meat wrapped in warm pita. These weren't luxuries, they were symbols, edible declarations that Greece was alive, that the same hands which once built temples and baked bread under marble columns still knew how to feed a nation. The first modern cafes appeared, buzzing with debate, laughter, and the clatter of spoons against porcelain cups. Food and freedom walked hand in hand, like old friends who had waited too long to meet again. In Athens, as the new capital rose from ruins, the streets grew louder, brighter, and hungrier. Immigrants arrived from Asia Minor after the great population exchange, bringing with them the flavors of Smyrna, Istanbul, and beyond. They carried recipes in their memory: kebabs spiced with paprika, syrup-drenched baklava, rice wrapped in grape leaves, and mixed them with Greek tradition until the line between old and new disappeared. The result was a street food renaissance. Suddenly, stalls selling souvlaki gyros, kauluri bread rings, and laukomades honey puffs became as common as temples once were. The smell of grilled meat and yeast filled the city squares, blending with the sound of traffic, laughter, and street musicians playing bouzouki tunes that told stories of longing and joy. Every city had its signature. In Athens, it was souvlaki, tender pieces of pork or chicken marinated overnight in olive oil, lemon, garlic, and oregano, grilled until smoky and served with warm pita, onions, and a dollop of yogurt. In Thessaloniki, it was bougatsa, crisp layers of pastry filled with custard or cheese, dusted with sugar or drizzled with honey, eaten standing up with coffee in hand as the sun rose over the sea. In the islands, food became poetry, made of salt and wind. Fishermen grilled sardines beside their boats, brushing them with lemon juice as waves licked the shore. Women sold fried chickpea fritters, olives cured in seawater, and slices of watermelon that tasted like sunlight itself. By the mid-20th century, after wars, famine, and rebuilding, the Greek street once again found its rhythm. Markets burst with color, tomatoes red as fire, cucumbers cool and green, herbs fresh from the hills. Food was everywhere, skewers sizzling over charcoal, sesame bread sold from wooden carts, vendors shouting prices in the chaos of the agora. But it wasn't just commerce, it was community. People gathered not just to eat, but to talk, to laugh, to argue politics and philosophy as their ancestors once had under the open sky. In every shared meal, the ghosts of Athens, Sparta, and Byzantium were still invited guests. And then came the travelers. Tourists, curious and wide-eyed, wandered through Greek cities in search of ruins and found something better, the living taste of the past. They tasted souvlaki from paper wraps, bit into tirapita cheese pies, still warm from the oven, sipped ouzo by the sea, and realized that Greek history wasn't trapped in museums. It was still cooking, still breathing, still served with lemon and laughter. The old vendors became storytellers again. To them, every dish was a lesson in patience, every flavor a link to someone long gone. When they flipped skewers or drizzled honey over dough, they weren't just feeding tourists, they were feeding time itself. Even modern Greece, with its fast cars, neon lights, and endless rush, never lost its street food soul. On any given evening, the air still hums with the smell of grilled meat, garlic, and oregano. Students crowd around souvlaki stands after midnight, laughing through mouthfuls of pita. Office workers grab kauluri from carts on their way to work, its sesame crunch marking the rhythm of the morning. Old men sit outside cafes, sipping coffee so strong it could wake philosophers from the grave, watching the world pass by at a pace only they understand. In every corner, history hums beneath the noise, a reminder that these streets once fed gods and heroes, soldiers and slaves, kings and farmers. The olive oil still shines golden, the bread still cracks warm, and the hands that serve them still carry the grace of centuries. Food remains the great equalizer, the quiet miracle that turns strangers into friends and survival into celebration. If you wander through Athens today, past the ruins of the agora, you might still find a small stall selling souvlaki, near where philosophers once debated the meaning of virtue. The vendor might sprinkle oregano over the meat, squeeze a wedge of lemon, and hand it to you with a smile that feels older than language. As you take that first bite, the smoke, the salt, the tang of yogurt, you are tasting the story of Greece itself, a story of endurance, generosity, and joy. A story written not in books, but in flavor. The same spirit lives in the villages. On a mountain road, you might stumble upon a woman selling pies filled with wild greens and cheese, her recipe passed down through 10 generations. By the sea, a fisherman might invite you to share his catch, grilled right there on a rock, drizzled with oil, pressed from his own grove. There's no ceremony, no luxury, just authenticity. Every meal is a communion, every bite an act of gratitude. And somewhere, deep in the night, when the streets are quiet and the last vendor packs away his cart, the scent of smoke and honey still lingers in the air. It rises gently, mingling with the hum of the city and the whisper of the sea. as if the ghosts of ancient Athens are still walking beside us, hungry, curious, and proud. The flame that once burned beneath a clay pot in a forgotten stall still burns now. On every street where food is cooked with care and shared with laughter. Because Greece never truly changed. It just kept eating, kept sharing, kept remembering. Its history isn't carved only in marble or written in old scrolls. It's cooked every day in pans, on grills, over open fires. Every souvlaki stand, every bakery window, every seaside taverna is a living museum, proof that civilization doesn't survive through conquest or wealth, but through taste, through the simple act of feeding each other, through the belief that even in hardship, life should be delicious. And so the story of ancient Greek street food never really ended. It just kept walking through centuries, through empires, through wars and revolutions, until it reached us. Still warm, still fragrant, still wrapped in bread. You can taste it in every bite, hear it in every sizzle, feel it in the laughter of strangers eating together. The gods may have left Olympus long ago, but they would still recognize this: the scent of olive oil, the sweetness of honey, the smoke of grilled meat rising into the night. The eternal language of Greece, the one you don't speak, you taste it.